In Monster Hunter Rise, out of all the weapons, the Switch Axe sees one of the greatest benefits from being in its powered up state. While powered up, or amped, each attack is followed up by an additional tick of damage, with a motion value of 10 and dealing full elemental output. As well as this, the player gains access to the zero-sum discharge, one of the weapon's best moves, with high damage and knockback resistance. Unfortunately, this state can't be entered at will. A certain amount of charge needs to be generated from landing hits, and additionally, this state wears off after a certain amount of time, with no option to refresh it. As a weapon, the Switch Axe has shown a variety of viable builds, in part due to the rebalancing of Phial types in Rise. Regardless, there are still numerical comparisons that can and have been made between these builds, as is to be expected. However, these comparisons often ignore the amped state, or more specifically, the proportion of time you would spend in this state. You may ask, why is this relevant? If this is static, can't it just be ignored? That's because, as you probably know, this isn't the case. For example, different Phials require different amounts of charge to enter the state, shown on the screen. We can split our many Phials here into just 4 categories, with Power Phials charging slowest, and Dragon or Poison Phials charging the fastest. Also, we have a skill called Power Prolonger, which, at 3 points, doubles the amount of time that the state will last every time you enter it. Focus is also a thing, but there's already good info out there on why it's useless. Now, let me give an example of how amped uptime can change things. These are 5 different builds used against one specific monster, with varying Phials and levels of Prolonger. I won't be naming these runs, as real people have put time and effort into making these builds, and it wouldn't be fair to criticize them, especially as they didn't have access to the information that I'll be getting into. Listed is the damage output that you would have using a certain move against a good part, both the hit itself and the following amped tick. Hopefully, seeing the increase in damage from the powered state helps show why it's an important factor to consider. Ignoring amped uptime or using a static estimate, this is how the builds would be ranked, from best to worst. However, if we add in the later discussed results of the study, we see things drastically change, with one of our lower builds shooting up into first. But we'll get back to explaining this later. It shouldn't be said that uptime has been completely ignored, it's simply a difficult topic. There have been previous attempts to estimate this value, either through mathematical models or just pure intuition. For example, a popular calculator for Switch Axe by Fox Invictus gives a default value for amped as 80%, something I've seen repeated in discussions online. However, an analysis of their posted runs gives their true in-combat uptime at around 61%, almost 20% lower. Note that this is not an attack against them, this is a very good player who has released quite a bit of gameplay research. This is simply a good example of how it's difficult to model behavior with pure theory. So if purely theoretical math models aren't accurate, what can we use? Well, we can instead make a model based off real-life data by performing an observational study. Luckily for us, people competent with a weapon do quite frequently upload their hunts online. We could simply view each uploaded hunt and find the proportion of combat time that they spend in the amped up state. Note here that I mentioned amped time while in combat. Amped time in general is a less useful metric. I couldn't really care how much time you spend exploring the map with a powered up weapon. In summary, this is a two-way study across Phial type and Power Prolonger level. I ended up analyzing over 100 hunts from 16 different hunters to find uptime values for both of our target factors. All hunts were taken off YouTube, as Bilibili is a nightmare if you can't read, and runs excluded were those that were under 2 minutes, either too short or too scripted to be useful, or runs with Nawa, as those have issues with UI elements. I also didn't use runs from the demo, due to changes in the weapon itself between it and the main game. Conversely, runs included are from all versions of the game, as there haven't been any changes that impact how amp charging works. This is in no way every Switch Axe run uploaded to the platform, just a good amount of what I could find through a quick search in English and Japanese. It would be easy to simply take a single run, calculate in-combat amp time, and state that Phial X has an uptime of Y with Z levels of Power Prolonger. However, this hunt could be against a tricky monster, or the player could be especially good or bad. To get the most accurate values possible within reason, we would need to average across parameters, such as player and the monster hunted, with as many hunts as possible, hence this study's sample size. It would be ridiculous to do all of this in person. Even analyzing one run by eye would take a noticeable amount of time and effort. and we also have the possibility of introducing human error. Instead, simple software can be written to do this for us. We can easily use traditional computer vision methods to report amped uptime while in combat, much more accurately and efficiently than if a person tried to do the same. I say traditional in the sense that the parameters for detection are set externally, and not learned and modified within the program. While you may be more familiar with computer vision linked with machine learning or some sort of associative network, this approach requires much less processing power, so it's faster, needs no training, and in this case it's just as accurate, as Monster Hunter Rise has a static UI with unchanging parameters. Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at the screen here. I've hidden every part of the UI that is useless for our purposes. All that remains is our combat icon in the top left and the weapon status. Now, let's enter combat and see what changes. Take a look at the UI now. While in combat, the weapon icon now flashes between its original state and a red eye visible on the screen. As a few hits have been landed, we can also see that the sword is surrounded by a black border which is filling up with white. Now, let's see what happens when we enter the amped state. This might take a little bit. Now that the switch axe is amped, notice the changes to the UI. The outline completely covers the object and has become blue. When these states, combat and amp, end, they return to how they were before. All of these changes will occur in exactly the same way every time the relevant events happen, giving us an easy way to detect them. Now, there's a few ways that the issue of detection could be approached. The obvious way would be to, for the region that we care about, threshold out a certain color, let's say red. We would then find the proportion of the region that is non-zero, and use these percentages to check which of the icons is present. Not too difficult. But since the overlay is static, I've gone for an even simpler solution. One could just sample out a few points from the region, average out their values to reduce the effect of any noise or video artifacting, and then compare these against a detection threshold. Of course, these points would be chosen in a way that they would only meet this threshold if either in combat or amped, either due to positioning or color value. You can somewhat see this in action here. Now that we've done this, we can simply tell the program to consider a player in combat if the icon is flashing red, and amped when the sword is glowing blue. Now we simply count all in combat frames, and all amped frames while in combat, and this leaves us with a final percentage. Here's a demonstration of the script in action, over a hunt nicely provided by Fox Invictus. It will also act as verification for those watching that we don't see any false positives or negatives. We see prompts returned whenever a state change occurs, and a final percentage at the end. And, just to show that the method transfers across different players, here's a run by RuseEXE. Both of these individuals have put themselves forward for this, for which I'm glad, if just so no one has to see my awkward sword flailing gameplay. Now, we just run the script around 100 more times, note the level of Power Prolonger and Phial used, and we have ourselves a solid dataset. Since there's not much precedent in Monster Hunter observational studies, I am going to cheat a bit and show you the finished study data itself to cover a few issues. Firstly, we need to know if amp time is even correlated to any variable, or are we going to see random, completely spread out and therefore useless results? Pretty much, do we have somewhat consistent results between different hunters and different monsters? We'll take a look at one of our larger groups, Phials with medium charge rate, with roughly 40 data points to answer this. On the screen is a QQ or quantile plot of the data, as well as the results of a Shapiro-Wilk test. Both of these show exactly the same thing, that the data is normally distributed, or is clustered around our point of interest in a roughly bell-curved fashion. We know this both from the linear distribution of points in the plot, as well as our returned p-value. Normally, just one of these tests would be enough to show this, but for presentation's sake, it's nice to have a visual aid for those unfamiliar with stats, and a stats test for if the plot is questionable. So this rules out the potential angle of uptime being completely random and independent. Secondly, is it valid to combine both elemental and exhaust files into the same group for later comparison? While they both take exactly the same amount of amp to enter an amped state, there may be some intangibles that can't easily be measured or perceived. Well, here are the two means for both groups, and here are the same procedures I've performed previously. Whether or not these groups are normal aren't as relevant here, as I've gone over that issue already, but them being so allows me to easily compare their means. Here are the results of a simple t-test, performed with Welch's correction. The extremely simplified takeaway from this is that these two groups are exactly the same. The minor difference you see is just chance-based variation. If these two means were truly different, we would have a much lower p-value. All in all, this should give you a bit more confidence in the results, if your familiarity is more with mathematical models instead of something like this. Now, onto the data. I have presented on the screen two figures, the top being a graph and the bottom being a table. Both of these show the same thing. I'll start by explaining the colors and the marks. Unfortunately, but as expected, people gravitate towards certain builds, leaving some combinations without many or even no analyzed runs. These are the table entries in red. Ones with slightly more compared to this are in plain text. This also isn't to say that there isn't enough info for confidence in the later results. For example, one of our largest groups, elemental files with 0 points in Power Prolonger, had over 40 data points. This condition and conditions like it are marked in green. In the graph, these are the larger circles. Our graph, as a result of lacking all data points, only graphs the power and element/exhaust file groups. We also have a linear fit between our higher confidence points, shown in a thinner line, which we use later, as it can be argued that this is a more valid approach. Each level of Power Prolonger does give a linear increase to amp time after all. Now, it's immediately obvious from these results that power files have a lower uptime than the alternative. This is completely expected, as they are slower to charge after all. For those that want to hear the numbers instead of reading them from the screen, here they are, rounded slightly. With a power file, the average uptime with max Power Prolonger is around 65%, while with none, you would only have 48%. With medium files, maximizing the skill gives an impressive 80% uptime, while not having any drops you down to 65%. Whether or not you want to consider the less supported data is up to you. The other increases may not be exactly linear, but do note that they are always increases, both in levels of skill and in file type. Finally, an interesting observation from these results is that medium files always average higher uptime than the slowest ones, easily seen in the graph. Even at 3 points in Power Prolonger, a power file has slightly less uptime than an elemental file with none. With this info in hand, we can begin to calculate how much damage each point of Power Prolonger gives us. So, earlier in the video, some builds suggest that the amped state increases your damage by about 40 to 45% on a purely numerical level, not counting any difficult to model increases that come from now being able to access CSD. As this number varies on factors such as build, with the increase only being around a quarter if you don't use an element, I have lowballed it a bit from our original range to 35%. As we have solid measurements for power and elemental or exhaust files at maximum and minimum levels of Power Prolonger, we can now infer from our linear fit that each level of Power Prolonger increases total in-amp time by about 5% for power files and about 4% for our other category. Combining this with our damage increase when amped value, we can say that each level of Power Prolonger results in a damage increase from your base damage of roughly 1.75% for the former category and 1.4% for the latter. This might not be as large as many have expected given its use in many popular builds, but it definitely is noticeable, especially considering its CSD applications, and in comparison to some other damage skills which provide similar numbers. Sure, a point in attack boost can give you a guaranteed 1% plus a bit damage boost, but it doesn't upgrade your moveset an extra 5% of the time. So let's contextualize this information and return to what we started with, comparing builds. I'll walk you through how our new metric can result in us reordering these builds. I had my friend Ralph, who I'll link to somewhere, do all the build math for me, as he's a little better at this type of thing. Take a look at our hit and sum columns here. I mentioned before that this is the damage you deal when amped or unamped. However, we can also consider them as static uptime estimates, either 0 or 100%. In a case where we are simply landing one hit, having a 0 or 100% uptime rate, and being amped or unamped are completely identical. Of course, rates of 100 or 0 are impossible in practice, meaning that comparing these isn't really worthwhile. As an extension, we can consider adding uptime on a single hit basis. Instead of saying that we gain 100% of the amped tick damage X% of the time, where X is the uptime value, we can instead say that we gain X% of the amped tick damage 100% of the time. That's what we see in the weighted sum column. Our base damage, plus a variable percentage of the total amped damage. Across the entire hunt, this is the true average damage that you would deal per hit. As you would have seen from the previous results, X is not a static variable, but changes based on our tested parameters. This is how our previously 4th place build is able to jump into 1st. Our top 2 builds here both have 0 points in Power Prolonger, while our nascent build has 3. We know from our data that this build has an extra 17% uptime, or while the previous builds only gained half of their amped damage on an average hit, this one gains 65%, resulting in a higher weighted sum. Here's an even more straightforward example, this time only using 2 hypothetical builds. One uses a power file and one uses an elemental one. These 2 builds seem to have exactly the same damage, with a hit of 100 and an amped tick of 35. If we add a static uptime, such as 0.8, these would obviously remain equal, and they would remain equal no matter what number you use. But if we add our new file-dependent value, we see a difference emerge. While build 1 only gains 48% of its amped damage on an average hit, our second gains 20% more, or 68% of the damage. It's pretty clear from these examples that there is merit to using an accurate uptime measurement when considering builds. So, here's a summary of this video. SwitchEXE damage and build discussion often ignores or provides flawed estimates for the amped state, or more specifically, this state's uptime. This is mainly due to the difficulty of a purely theoretical model accounting for real-world behavior. To solve this type of problem, we can use an observational study, and with the properties of the game, a traditional computer vision approach works well. Following the analysis of over 100 hunts, we can provide accurate estimates now for amp uptime while in combat. If you're using a power file, this ranges between 65 and 48%, and if you're using element or exhaust, from 80 to 68%, with this range entirely dependent on your level of Power Prolonger. We can also quickly math out with this information that each point of Power Prolonger increases your base damage by 1.75 or 1.4%. Finally, adding uptime parameters can drastically change how good a build is perceived to be. A build can and will pull ahead just on the basis of different amounts of time spent powered up. Here, I'm obliged to say that if you enjoyed what you saw, I'd appreciate some interaction with the video, such as a like or a sub. Also, since I now have a good framework for working with the RuseEXE UI, I'm open to any suggestions for what difficult to model parameters you might want to see covered. Thank you for watching, and see you next video.